Hello, and thanks for stopping by. Here's a question for you. How would you fancy spending the nights down here, on the platform of this London Underground station? Reckon you could do it? It's not the most pleasant of prospects, is it? The floor's hard, there's no natural light of course, and no toilet facilities. It's warm and dusty, and it's certainly not for those who are claustrophobic or easily spooked. Now imagine what it would be like to sleep here, crammed amongst over 1,000 other people, with strangers snoring nearby, and the cries of restless babies echoing along the platform, all whilst bombs rain down on the streets up above. In the Second World War, this was the reality for many Londoners, who, faced with night after night of air raids, headed down into the city's tube network in search of safety and the hope of a few hours' rest. In all, 79 deep-level stations were adapted for this purpose, from South Wimbledon in the south, and Southgate in the north, to Shepherd's Bush in the west, and Bethnal Green in the east. And in doing so, these deep-level stations were transformed into small subterranean communities, complete with bunk beds, medical bays, catering services, and even the occasional concert. That said though, the reality of sheltering in a London tube station during the Blitz was far from rosy, and in this video I'd like to try and convey some idea of what the experience was truly like. Images of Londoners sheltering on the tube in the early 1940s are amongst the most evocative to depict Britain's home front in World War II. This wasn't the first time the Underground had been used in such a manner though. During the First World War, the Germans' huge Zeppelin airships, and then later in the conflict, Gotha bombers, had also subjected the nation to aerial attack. And when London was targeted, the deep-level tube stations, which were then still relatively new, were the obvious choice in which to take cover. This large painting by Walter Bayes, entitled The Underworld, which dates from 1918 and can now be seen in the Imperial War Museum, depicts a group of World War I shelterers gathered at Elephant and Castle Station. In those days, the tube network was considerably smaller than it is today, and the authorities were happy to tolerate its platforms being used as a refuge. In some cases, it was even encouraged, as police officers, who in World War I were responsible for calling out the air raid warnings, would often advise people to head to the nearest station. Altogether, bombing from the air killed 667 civilians during the Great War, with over another 1,900 people injured. And it's been speculated that, had the Underground not been available, those figures may well have been much higher. In the 1936 film adaptation of H.G. Wells's novel The Shape of Things to Come, one scene shows civilians being told to take shelter in the underground railways as a catastrophic Second World War, correctly predicted by Wells when he wrote the book in the early 1930s, suddenly erupts.
Go home. Those who are far from home can take refuge in the underground railways. Go home. Go home.
In reality though, and despite the positive role it had played during World War I, the government had become reluctant to allow the underground to be used as a shelter in any future conflict. So much so that, as early as 1924, a directive was issued to prevent it from ever happening again. There were several reasons for this, one being that, in the event of a war, it was expected that the underground would need to be kept clear for essential traffic. It was also feared that, in the face of ever-advancing military technology, many stations simply wouldn't be able to provide adequate protection, a concern which, as we'll later see, was tragically proven to be correct. This went in line with another concern, that in the event of heavy bombardment, the London Underground was at risk of flooding, although attempts to combat this were made with the installation of 25 6-ton floodgates spread across various points of the network. You can still see one such floodgate at Embankment Station. On a more negative note, as World War II began to cast its ominous shadow, many officials, Churchill included, theorised that if people were permitted to take refuge on the underground, then a deep shelter mentality would develop. In other words, they believed that, once down there, people would refuse to come back up, thus shirking their wartime duties, and when the issue was discussed, derogatory terms such as subway squatter and troglodyte were bandied about. There was a considerable element of hypocrisy to this, as the government already had their very own shelter on the London Underground, one that had been converted from the abandoned Down Street station in Mayfair, which had closed to the public in 1932. You can just about spot the remnants of the old Down Street station when passing between Green Park and Hyde Park Corner on the Piccadilly line. Swiftly adapted for wartime use in the late 1930s, Down Street was first used by the Railway Executive Committee, who were tasked with keeping Britain's railways running during the war. And as the Cabinet's War Rooms bunker was being finalised beneath Whitehall, Down Street was also made available to government ministers, although Churchill himself, never keen on being below ground, spent very little time there.
This is London. You will now hear a statement by the Prime Minister.
With a new war imminent, the evacuation of children commenced on the 1st of September 1939, some 48 hours before Neville Chamberlain's grim radio broadcast, in which he declared that Britain was now at war with Germany. The Underground played a major role in facilitating the evacuation, and in the space of 4 days, London Transport helped ferry over 500,000 evacuees to safety. During this period, posters were put up in stations stating that the tube was not to be used as a shelter, and it was a message emphasised in an announcement made just minutes after Chamberlain's broadcast.
The London tube railways are required for traffic purposes, and the tube stations are not available as air raid shelters.
This caused little concern at first, for after the initial drama, things on the home front remained relatively quiet, the so-called phony war. However, as Hitler's forces overwhelmed Denmark and Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg and France, the threat of aerial attack from the Luftwaffe became a reality, starting in July 1940 with the Battle of Britain, then, from September 1940, the sustained bombing campaign of British cities, which came to be known as the Blitz. The first major raid on London occurred on the 7th of September 1940, as over 360 bombers, escorted by 515 fighters, roared over the city. In the ensuing raid, 430 people were killed. It must be remembered that, at the time, shelter provision was far from adequate. There were a few options, namely the tin shed-like Anderson design, and the, in my view, frankly terrifying looking Morrison cage. These were of no use of course though, if you didn't have a garden, or a room large enough to put one in. Some people managed to squeeze into cupboards under the stairs, and there were a number of communal above-ground brick shelters, although these were generally avoided as they looked far from safe. And in some cases, simple trenches dug into the ground were available too, although these were often sodden with water. With all of this in mind then, it's not surprising that many people were drawn towards the deepness of the tube, and on the 8th of September, a large crowd gathered outside Liverpool Street Station, then the easternmost point of the Central Line, where they found the entrance gated and under police guard. Nevertheless, the fear was real, and a determined group managed to barge their way in. Similar incidents occurred on the Northern Line, at Warren Street, Goodge Street and Old Street. Over the following days, those wishing to overcome the ban on sheltering did so in a far less dramatic manner. They exploited a loophole by purchasing a cheap ticket as if they intended to travel. Then, once on the platforms, they could pitch up for the night. By the 21st of September 1940, it was estimated that 120,000 people were camped out on the London Underground, with that figure rising to 124,000 by the following month. It rapidly became clear to the government that it would be impractical to prevent so many civilians from seeking shelter on the tube. On a political level, it was feared communist committees would begin organising the huge crowds down below. There had already been evidence of such groups taking the initiative at Tufnell Park Station, along with Kentish Town and Camden Town. Plus, of course, barring women, children and the elderly from seeking refuge in what they considered to be a place of safety, would not play well in terms of propaganda. The government therefore relented and asked the London Passenger Board, the LPTB, in conjunction with local authorities, to facilitate the situation. This resulted in compact medical posts being established, along with marshals, many of who were women, being brought in to shepherd the thousands of people pouring into each station. 24,000 three-tier bunk beds, which could be folded up during the daytime, were also installed throughout the tube, and had they been laid end to end, this line of bunks would have stretched for some 27 miles. Space was of course limited, and with shelterers not being permitted entry until the early evening, long queues would begin to form outside each station from the early afternoon onwards. Some spivs saw an opportunity in this, and groups of these shady characters would get in early to bag prime spots on the platforms, which, as the night approached, they'd begin charging money for, up to £0.50 in some cases. As you can imagine, such hoarding of space led to many a heated argument, and in some cases, physical fights breaking out. In an attempt to combat this, tickets for sheltering soon began to be issued, although you still had to queue for many hours to get one. And as in World War I, a code of conduct was drawn up. Paths were to be kept clear for passengers, you had to be out by 7 AM, and parents were requested to keep your children under control. Don't allow them to play on the escalators, lifts, and trains. Not everyone heeded this advice though. As one fellow named Les Gaskin later recalled, some children did muck about on the escalators. There was one kid one night, got his fingers caught in the belt. Another shelterer, Mary Davis, said, "There were accidents, though of course they didn't tell you about them at the time."
This is Lancaster Gate.
At Lancaster Gate Station, I would step out onto a platform which seemed at first sight to be piled up with corpses from some terrible catastrophe, wrote the journalist Tom Hopkinson when recalling his memories of travelling by the tube during the Blitz. Another journalist, writing at the time for the South London Press, stated, "I stumbled over huddled bodies which were no safer from bombs than if they'd lain outside in the gutters on the streets. Little girls and boys lay across their parents' bodies because there was no room on the winding stairs. On the platform, when a train came in, it had to be stopped in the tunnel while police and porters went along, pushing in the feet and arms which overhung the line." Once tube services ended for the night and the electrical current was switched off, the station's lights would be dimmed and a number of hurricane lamps lit. With no more trains running, shelterers were then permitted to spread beyond a designated whitewash line painted along the platform edge, which, as seen in many photographs, resulted in people dozing off on the tracks. Hammocks were also slung over the rails, whilst others did their best to get their heads down on stairwells and the wooden escalators. When interviewed in the autumn of 1940, one young man claimed such conditions were, quote, "good training for roughing it in the army. I'll go in a few weeks' time." In some cases, tube trains would be parked alongside a platform, thus granting the use of more seats and floor space. To some, this may sound deceptively cosy, but in reality, sheltering on the tube was a pretty ghastly business. "The snoring rose and fell like a loud wind," recalled one woman, and hygiene, not easy to maintain under such wartime conditions, was poor, made worse by the fact that there was no fresh air, as ventilation systems were switched off in case of a gas attack. As such, the odour was dreadful. One woman, named Evelyn Rose, later said, "The smell was so bad, I don't know how people did not die from suffocation." This smell would have mingled with pungent clouds of tobacco smoke, smoking in those days being permitted on the underground, and a popular way of calming nerves during wartime. Indeed, a number of stations installed cigarette vending machines to specifically cater for those sheltering. The heat would also rise to unbearable levels, and mosquitoes, of which the London Underground is unfortunate enough to harbour its very own unique breed, had a field day. So bad was the mosquito problem, in fact, that by early 1941, each station had to be sprayed each morning with a special disinfectant to deter the little critters. Bed bugs posed a problem too, and in October 1940, the MP, Dr. Edith Summerskill, described a complaint dubbed shelter throat, which had developed amongst children, it seemingly being caused by youngsters having to sleep in their damp clothes until the early morning hours when they are dragged off to their cold homes. If that wasn't enough, the threat of influenza, pneumonia, and tuberculosis spreading amongst the tightly packed crowds also remained a constant worry. As for toilets, well, with so many people taking up space sleeping, there was little room to squeeze in such facilities. The main lavatories employed were Elsan chemical toilets, along with a number of buckets. There weren't many though. To give you an idea of the ratio, Holborn Station, which could accommodate 4,600 people, had just 4 chemical lavatories and 4 buckets. Inevitably, those who were desperate took to urinating in discreet corners, and on the track too in some cases. Some people, particularly the elderly, would sleep amongst bundles of their most valued possessions, the fear of course being that if they were left above ground, they risked being either blown to smithereens or looted. As one woman named Angus Calder recalled, "I would occasionally give a hand to an old lady with a bursting suitcase in one hand and a bundle which appeared to contain all her cooking pots, china ornaments, and her tea service in the other." As for children, it's estimated that, despite the evacuation, around 25,000 regularly slept on the tube. Children's parties were sometimes held to keep the spirits up, and a number of babies were also born deep within the shelters, the most famous being the future American politician and controversial talk show host Jerry Springer, who went to the world at Highgate Station in 1944. This mass of humanity congregating in such an unorthodox place created mini-communities, or townlets as one newspaper described them, and in some cases, regular shelterers began referring to different parts of their station as if they were residential addresses: escalator passage, crossways passage, and so on. At first, people were expected to bring their own food and drink, although the need for organised catering quickly became apparent. The first refreshment service was introduced at Holland Park Station on the 29th of October 1940, and over the following few years, it's estimated over 500,000 gallons of tea were brewed up across the underground, although you did have to bring your own mug. A special train, the Tube Refreshment Special, also rumbled between stations, delivering tea, coffee and cocoa, along with buns, biscuits, apples, pies and sausage rolls. To while away the time, card games were popular, and where possible, stations established small libraries of books and newspapers. Some shelters even published their own newsletters. Meanwhile, the ENTSA, the Entertainment's National Service Association, would visit stations to screen films and stage Shakespeare plays. Music was actively encouraged, some platforms being kitted out with gramophones, and on a few special occasions, celebrities even turned up to perform, the most notable being George Formby, who visited Aldwych, and the American band leader Glenn Miller, who turned up for an impromptu gig one evening at Marble Arch Station. Despite being so deep underground, London's tube stations were far from 100% safe, and during the course of the war, there were a number of horrific incidents in which many people were killed or injured. The first such disaster occurred on the 13th of October 1940, when 2 properties either side of Bounds Green Station were bombed, resulting in a tunnel collapse. 19 people lost their lives, 16 of whom were Belgian refugees, who had managed to escape with British forces during the evacuation of Dunkirk. The following evening, just after 8 PM on the 14th of October, a bomb smashed into the northern end of Balham Tube Station, creating a large crater into which a double-decker bus, thankfully out of service, crashed. The Balham bomb also severed the water mains and a sewage pipe, which unleashed a flood, a terrifying deluge of water and sludge, in which over 60 people drowned. The horror of the Balham Station bombing was later used as a plot device in Ian McEwan's 2001 novel Atonement, and the scene was depicted in the subsequent film adaptation. On the 11th of January 1941, Bank Station, right in the heart of the city, was hit by a high explosive, which smashed through the road and exploded in the ticket hall close to the escalators, the blast being powerful enough to damage 2 trains passing deep below. The bank bomb created a huge 1,800 square foot crater and killed 56 people, with many more injured. Britain's largest single loss of civilian life in World War II occurred at Bethnal Green Station on the 3rd of March 1943. At the time, the station did not yet open to traffic. It was under construction as part of an extension to the Central Line, although as the tunnels were complete, it was agreed to bring them into use as a lodge shelter. On the 2nd of March 1943, the RAF had conducted a major raid over Berlin, which left Londoners on edge, as they were expecting a huge retaliation in return. Then, on the evening of the 3rd of March, the sirens sounded, even though no air attack was approaching. And at the same time, and with no warning, a decision was made to test the large anti-aircraft guns, which were stationed in nearby Victoria Park. With the sirens blaring and the guns pounding away, hundreds made a beeline for Bethnal Green Station, the staircase of which had no central handrail and, due to blackout conditions, was lit by just one light. In the scramble, a woman carrying her young baby tripped and fell. An elderly man fell over her, and then others over him, leading to a horrific pile-on involving some 300 people. In all, 173 people lost their lives on this very staircase, 62 of whom were children, the main cause of death being asphyxiation caused by the crush. A plaque commemorating those who died at Bethnal Green was unveiled above the steps to mark the 50th anniversary in 1993, and in 2017, this memorial, the Stairway to Heaven, was installed outside the station's entrance. Many of those who died in the disaster were buried together at Manor Park Cemetery, although sadly, in recent years, the ground used for their graves was reclaimed. Thankfully though, a number of the victims' simple headstones were saved and moved across to a spot beneath this tree, where they now form a small memorial.